So when we're really talking about soil fertility, we're just checking on the soil's current status to supply the needed elements that are essential for plant growth. The soil test is a good tool to measure the soil fertilities and get a point in time of its ability to supply the essential nutrients to the plants. From that tool, we can then determine how much fertilizer we need to apply to our soils. So that's important. So we need to determine the nutrient requirements and pH of the plants that we are growing, and that's why I would recommend that we plant plants that have same requirements together in beds versus doing it in more of a spotty arrangement. If you want to do it in a spotty arrangement, you just need to realize you need to manage each site for that plant's preference in pH instead of managing it all as just one bed. We want to get representative samples, so that's a minimum of 10, if not 15 subsamples that we combine together to get a representative sample for that area. We always talk about, or at least I do, the bird flying overhead. He does release nutrients occasionally. That happens to be the one sample you take where they release nutrients, or a cat fertilized your yard is another example. Your soil test would not be accurate for the area. That's why we need to take many samples to dilute out one bad sample. And believe it or not, soils are very variable. If I took 10 subsamples of the same area in your yard and analyzed them separately, they would be very different among themselves. We're just trying to get an average to use as a tool to manage our soils. We need to use a certified soil testing lab. There's several. The one my office tends to use is A&L Labs out of Fort Wayne. So when we're thinking about soil management, we're really thinking about a long-term process. So we need to test every 3 to 5 years, depending on how stable your soil is. If you got Shirley's soil, you got to do it at least every 3 years because her soil is not very stable. It's a sandy soil that's going to tend to change readily. If you have a muck soil, every 5 years is going to be fine because it's a very stable soil and it's hard to change it. So once you get it adjusted, it should be in pretty good shape. Determine the size to fertilize so that you can then take a soil test and translate it into the fertilizer you need to purchase and apply. Know your fertility requirements for your plants. Adjust fertilizer application based upon soil fertility. One nutrient that tends to test high, and I'll show this in my soil test, is phosphorus. Because plants don't need phosphorus as much as other nutrients, and if it's a garden soil, people have a habit of buying 12, 12, 12 or 10, 10, 10. So when they're applying their nutrients to the soil, the nitrogen, which is a mobile nutrient within your soil, and plants need at a high level, and potassium, the plants need at a high level, tend to be at, the potassium tends to be at a more reasonable level in the soil, but the phosphorus that does not need as much will tend to build up over time and can be very high. Make sure appropriate amounts of fertilizer is applied in an even manner. We don't want streaks in our application of our fertility because it will create uneven responses by the plants that we grow. And then we want to apply the fertilizer in a timely fashion so that the plant's able to take care of it. Depending on the form of potassium we apply, it may be better actually to apply it in the fall of the year versus the spring of the year, so it has time to adjust in the soil. If we do need to change our soil pH for the growing season, it's better to do it in the fall of the year to give time for that pH change to happen before you plant into it the following year. And then when we're gathering the soils, it's going to depend upon, we need to make sure that what we're using is clean. We need to make sure that the plastic bucket has not been used for something else that could impact the results. We don't want rusty tools to use to collect our soil. The sample bags you can get from the extension office, or just use a clean plastic bag until you can get it into a container to send it off to the lab. We need to gather site information on determining how to sample it. The best garden I've ever seen, one of the best, actually multiple of them, it's been due to livestock manure. One was they used a horse manure from a local stable. The other one used to have hogs in a lot, and they stopped raising hogs and they planted their garden there. Once it was safe, you have to give time so the organisms that are part of the hog manure are broken down. But that had a lot of organic matter, so it's a highly productive soil. So I wouldn't test that. I test that separately from the soil that didn't have the hogs on, because I know there's going to be different soil properties, even though they may be the same soil type and same elevation. Now, if I'm testing for grass, I only go down 3 inches deep for 2 reasons. One, the roots tend to be mainly in the upper 3 inches. Hopefully we mow our grass properly so they're deeper than that. But the other reason is because we're not going to till it in. So when we apply fertilizer, it's going to impact that upper 3 inches. And we're really not going to have much impact on the lower soil. We're looking at shrubs. We go a little deeper because the roots tend to be deeper. And we may have to take effort to get the fertilizer down deeper, because we're not going to obviously till the soil around our shrubs either. And then with trees, we go down 8 to 12 inches because trees are definitely deeper rooted, and we can use soil injectors to fertilize down to that depth if need be. If we're doing a garden soil, we would go down to the tillage depth, which tends to be 6 to 8 inches as well, because we can work the fertilizer into the soil prior to planting our garden. We don't want to send in debris, organic matter in the soil sample. We want to make sure it's just the soil. We want to mix the subsamples together thoroughly so we can get one good sample out of all the subsamples that we take. And it's good to allow the sample to air dry before we send it in. They will have to do that process if they get it wet. A&L Labs is a laboratory we use due to geographic location. I live in Indiana. I like to support Indiana businesses. That's my bias. So a basic garden test would cost $20 for the basic test. If you want the micronutrients tested, and some micronutrients can be indicated by pH if they're going to be deficient, but I have been surprised by some people that have the micronutrients tested. The main one that is actually a macronutrient that we routinely don't test, that maybe we should test occasionally, is sulfur, because the fact that it is mobile and can be an indicator that we need to be monitoring our plants for sulfur deficiency. If you pay for these tests, they'll give recommendations based upon what you're growing. So there's different selections. So this would be a test result that you get back from a garden soil test sent in. They'll give you, if it's medium, very low to very high. As I was talking about phosphorus is very high in this one. So is potassium, and so is magnesium, so that's high too. So those nutrients do not need to be tested for, fertilized with. High to very high, we usually feel fairly comfortable that the soil has adequate levels. When a soil says medium, that means there's adequate levels in the soil test to meet the plant needs, but due to the variability of the soil inherently, there may not actually be enough of that nutrient available throughout the whole region that you tested. because if it's medium, usually we get to medium by some areas being higher and some areas being a little bit lower. The concern here would be like calcium is at a medium level, and that's pretty typical for northern Indiana soils, actually. But we usually consider that not to be one that we need to fertilize or add unless we need to change the soil pH. This on the cation exchange capacity, that's what I was talking about. So it has a medium, this is a medium soil and holding capacity. 13.1 is fairly high for a mineral soil. So that's a decent cation exchange capacity. The organic matter is 3.6. They call that medium. And for our native soils, that would be medium if we haven't done anything to them. But soils that tend to be tilled like garden spots, sometimes that organic matter drops down to 1.5%, because as we till soils, we aerate them. And as we aerate them, things like organic matter tends to go down, or at least the active organic matter, because aerated soils tend to have more activity in them to break down that portion of our soils, organic matter. pH is 6.6, so that's a good pH. Don't need to do anything on this soil to raise the soil pH. Unless you're growing alfalfa, that's a one plant that likes pH of 7 that I know off the top of my head. Clovers actually do well at 6.6. Taking it higher doesn't help them out. But it says the buffer pH is 6.9, so that's that soil really shouldn't be have lime applied to it based upon that indicator. So when we're looking at soil tests, I'm going to show you that graph from how to adjust the soil pH. The potassium should be pounds per acre. 0 to 25 pounds will be low, medium 26 to 50 pounds, and above 51 pounds would be high. And then potassium is a nutrient that we need at a higher level. A high level is 151 to 200 pounds per acre. Compare that back to the phosphorus, which is at 51. So you can see that we want the soil test at a higher level of potassium because the soils, the plants need it at that level to perform uniformly across a region. Now this can be confusing because these are reported in parts per million. So to get pounds per acre, you always take parts per million, you multiply it by 2, because someone weighed an acre of soil and said it weighed 2 million pounds. So parts per million, if you're looking at pounds per acre, you would double it to represent pounds per acre. So this is a soil test I sent in for our Master Gardener class. So there's random identifiers on it, so I could use it. What do we see in these 3 soil samples? They all are very high in phosphorus. You can see potassium, one is actually low in potassium, being at 57 parts per million, or relating that back to pounds per acre, that'd be 114. So it's at a low level. Medium in the other 2 soils. For magnesium, another macronutrient we routinely test on all soil samples, it would be low for magnesium. So that's going to impact the uptake of magnesium if it's low in magnesium, and potassium is, well, not that much, it's medium. We'll look off to the right here in a minute. And then medium, and then high in magnesium. So we have 3 different levels. The one way that we tend to fertilize our soils with magnesium is through dolomitic limestone. But if you look at the pH off to the right, the one that's low in magnesium has a pH of 7.5. So we're not going to supplement it that way with dolomitic limestone because the pH is already very high. And then that makes sense then that soil calcium is very high because of the pH being high and calcium being the liming agent we use to raise pH. And then also the 750 is very high. And why would that be very high when the very low at 750 and then medium at 1500? So we have a pH of 5.5 with the soil that's low in calcium. So this is actually one that we could add ag lime to raise the soil pH and supplement with calcium. Sometimes, though, we'll have a pH that we do not want to raise, but we need to supplement with calcium, which when it's very low, we need to supplement with calcium. And we can use gypsum in that instance because gypsum has sulfur associated with the calcium to keep it from raising the soil pH. So that's a tool we can use to raise calcium levels in soils that we do not want to raise the soil pH. And in Marshall County, sometimes are like the bottom one is we have a medium calcium number and the soil pH is already very high at 7.2. So we usually in that case, there's adequate calcium that we do not need to do anything on the calcium. And we can have our plants be productive and have adequate calcium as long as we have the proper soil conditions for the plant to uptake the nutrients from the soil. And looking at the cation exchange capacity, we have a very high one for the first soil, the TL1, for a mineral soil. And the organic matter is at 3.4, so it's a soil that probably has some clay in it because of that higher cation exchange capacity on it compared to the other ones. 9.1 and 10.1 are more typical cation exchange capacities for mineral soils in Marshall County. That's more normal. Then you look clear off to the right. Well, what are all those numbers? Well, those numbers are indicating if one nutrient that's being held by the soil, cations, that's all three of those are cations, if that's going to impact the uptake of another one. You can see in the bottom one, and it's low in our soil test, potassium, it's only 1.4. We would typically like to see our potassium percents in our soil being held on more close to 5, so we don't have a high potassium soil, and that's reflected in that percent of potassium being held on the soil on the right side of the chart. The magnesium, again, the middle one is high in magnesium, and that's would be reflected in that 15.6, and high in the bottom one at 24.3. Typically, I would think we like it more like the 15 or 20 range, but the top one is below 10%, and we can see that the magnesium is low in the soil. So that is reflected again in that percent being held on by the soil. And then if our calcium is really high in the soil being held on, that's going to impact your soil pH. And you can see that in the top soil number, that it's very high in calcium and the pH is higher than we want. As we climb, I've seen soils that are 8 and above, and that impacts the ability of the plants to grow. This is a chart just showing how we can change soil pH in the soil. This is coming out of that HO32. But you can see pounds of sulfur required per 100 square feet to lower pH. And you can see it's based upon being sandy, medium soil like a loam soil, or finer soil being a clay soil. So the coarse soil, the sands, it takes less added to the soil to lower the pH. And if you look at the bottom, Again, pounds of limestone required per 100 square feet to bring soil pH up to 6.5. Again, you can see on the sandy soils, the lower cation exchange capacity soils with low holding capacity, it takes much less lime to raise the soil pH as well. And that's why we test those soils more often than a medium soil, we call them, the loam soils, or the finer soils, which are the clays. Because they have they have the clay and the organic matter to hold on to nutrients in those soils. And we don't even address organic soils in this chart because they're very different. So if you have a question about a muck soil, give me a call. Because we really can't change the pH. It's hard to change the pH in a muck soil, so we usually manage it at the pH it is at, which tends to be around 5.5 is the pH. That's where blueberries grow naturally, and that's why it tend to be in those lower pH type soils, and that's why they develop to use micronutrients in that type of an environment. So I see we're at 1 o'clock. Does anyone have any questions? I talked too long. I'm sorry. That's too wordy. For those that don't mind staying with me, I'll try to wrap this up. So processed and organic fertilizers, the big differences. Processed are components that are manufactured or refined from natural ingredients such as rock phosphate and converts the material into a form of plant roots can take up more easily. So there's several of these processed fertilizers that gardeners can have access to and utilize. Organic fertilizers are materials derived from plant and animals, or even you can have an organic, these are usually slow release nutrients as microorganisms break down the organic fertilizer and during the growing season, and you need warmer temperatures for microbe activity. That one garden that the green beans were stuck in vegetative growth is because of this. It's organic fertilizer that he applied annually, but the weather was perfect for the microorganisms to release and break down that organic matter that's in that soil. And that's why the nitrogen released from the soil was keeping green beans from blooming early. Now there's another term, organic fertilizers, which can be from natural minerals such as rock phosphate, but it has to be the rock phosphate, not the processed phosphate. And that's organic, meaning natural, not organic, meaning actually plant and animal material. See, this is where I get confused, because we have an organic fertilizer that has nothing to do with carbon structures, which is organic says. But that's a term we use for naturally derived fertilizers that we use that we want to grow plants naturally. Ways that we apply fertilizer, we broadcast over an entire area. That's how we fertilize our lawns. Banding is a good method to use when we're growing things in rows. Side dressing, you can come back and band plants later on with additional fertilizer. And that's what I would definitely do on soils that have a low cation exchange capacity. Sandy soils, I would put out some fertilizer early and come back and side dress to make sure the plant has adequate nutrients throughout the whole growing season, depending on what they need. Starter fertilizers are just high in phosphorus, and we talked about the need for that plant development to have adequate phosphorus, and phosphorus tends to get tied up in our soils or it's not readily available. I should note that the soil tests are actually testing for only the nutrients that are available to the plants, not the overall quantity that is in the soil, so that we can make fertilizer decisions. Foliar fed is directly on the foliage, and we always have to be careful not to damage our plants when we're foliar feeding with fertilizers. So we need to follow label directions and apply the right rate because we can burn those leaves if we over apply. We'll talk about it in a second. We can do it to the roots as well. Slow release coated is typically what we apply to our lawns so that it's released throughout the growing season instead of immediately going into the soil solution. So slow release or fertilizers coated in a manner so that they are releasing the nutrients to the soil at different times. Spikes is a tool that you put in the soil, trying to have a zone that's high in nutrients that the plant can draw from. And then we do have root feeders, and we use those particularly with trees that are deficient in nutrients other than mobile nutrients that move in the soil, such as nitrogen and sulfur. Those are two fairly mobile nutrients. But already talked about potassium and phosphorus can get tied up in our soil. So if we want to put higher levels of those nutrients down into the soil for the lower roots, we'd have to use a tool like this to inject down there. So we have to remember that fertilizers are salt. So a high salt levels kills roots. I have done this before. So that's why you want to follow label directions, and remember the soil that you're applying the fertilizer to, because in sandy soils, low CE, low cation exchange capacity soils, the fertilizer goes right into the soil solution and impacts the roots immediately. Where other soils will tend to tie up some of that fertilizer and not have it all readily available to the plant roots in the soil solution. So you want to be careful about placing the fertilizer too close to roots. In this, I knew a person that their spouse shared with me that went out and dumped fertilizer by newly planted trees right by the tree. Well, she killed several of her trees by doing that. Most likely to quickly dissolve in the fertilizer. So we want to remember that if we need adequate moisture and that it's readily available to the soil solution. Organic fertilizers tend not to be, so we tend to be safe except for with poultry manure. That's one that has a lot of available nitrogen in it that can go in the soil solutions. So you want to just think about fertilizing newly established plants. And I've killed plants by over-fertilizing that were just germinating because I didn't think this through. That's fine. Thank you for coming. So on any fertilizer bag, just remember the three numbers is nitrogen on a percent weight basis in the product by weight. So if it's a 50-pound bag of fertilizer, there's 5 pounds of available nitrogen in the bag. 10% of it, in this case, is potash, K2O. So there's 5 pounds in this bag, or 10% of it is by weight potash. And the same way for the middle number, which is that phosphate, that phosphorus number. That's why using a 10-10-10 probably is not a good idea, because we tend to over apply the phosphorus when we're using this fertilizer if there's not a need for that phosphorus. So that's why a soil test is good to have before you use a fertilizer that supplies phosphorus at the same level as nitrogen and potassium before we select that fertilizer. They sell fertilizers that have that middle number be 0, so it could be like 10, 0, 10. And so if you live in a lake community or don't have a soil test, I would use that. Recommend getting a soil test. And then looking at this soil bag, it's going to give you levels of if there's any other nutrients available, but the top 3 numbers are, again, the nitrogen, the phosphate, and potassium. It will give you how to use and apply the fertilizer you bought. And then it'll derive, it'll share if there's micronutrients available in that fertilizer. So you can use that as a tool to determine if you need to purchase that fertilizer. So the math behind fertilizer analysis. So if it's 12% nitrogen times that 50 pounds, we have 6 pounds of nitrogen. Not all bags are labeled the same with the same 3 numbers. So 4% of it's being phosphate. You would have 2 pounds of phosphate in that 50-pound bag. 0.04 times 50 is 2. And if it's 9% potassium, 0.09 times 50 is 4.5 pounds. So we have about 12.5 pounds of actual fertilizer in the bag. But what's important for application is knowing what the site needs, and particularly the nitrogen and being a major nutrient that the plant needs, but also the phosphate and potassium to make sure we're applying those at the right rates. That one soil test we looked at were very high in both P and K, so we wouldn't be buying a fertilizer like this to fertilize that soil test site because we don't need to add additional P and K to that site. So if I want to apply a 1/2 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet using an 18010 product, the math would be is then to know how many pounds we need to apply. We know in that, so in that 18%, there's for a 1/2 pound, it would, so 18% of, 1 pound would only be 0.18. So we need to take that 0.18, divide it into 0.5 to determine that we need roughly 3.3 pounds of fertilizer to give a 1/2 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So you have to divide that percent into the amount that you want to determine how many pounds of fertilizer you need. If that's not confusing, I'll try it again. So this is showing you the math. So actually it came out 2.78 pounds. My calculator in my head wasn't accurate. So that's what you apply to get that level at that site. We can talk about organic fertilizers next week and livestock manure pounds per ton. Just remember that this actually is liquid. This is actual manure coming out of the place. What you buy in the grocery store, they take the water out of it. This would be including the water, but we'll talk about that next week. Some pictures of bags of fertilizer. That would be for turf. These are the Miracle Grow products that can be foliar fed or just added to the soil. If you're foliar feeding these, be careful not to use a rate that's too high to cause burn. But you can see we have ones that they have different levels based upon the site. The one for lawns would be high in nitrogen, low in P and K. The ones to promote blooms would have a higher phosphorus level in them. And an all-purpose one is going to supply the micronutrients you need when you're using a plant growing a medium that's not soil. So if you're, when you buy potting soil, it has those slow release fertilizers in it that release the micronutrients and macronutrients into the soil, but as those are used up and are washed out as you water your plants, then you need to supplement them with a fertilizer that provides the micronutrients along with the macronutrients as well to keep your plants inside the house or container grown plants outside healthy. This is just the perfect tool to acidify a soil if you're going to plant an acid-loving plant, because this peat moss will tend to have a pH in the 5s, so that will naturally lower soil pHs. Instead of showing you more slides, I'm available for questions if anyone has questions.